and I'll get this party started. Oh, I'm sorry, it's not really a party. It's an educational program, but who says that can't be a party? So if you're here, that means you want to know more about the fundamentals of an employee handbook. I had a different title, but unfortunately, HR told me that was not to be used. We won't say what it was. So Brian Kinzie is going to be an instructor, but before we get in that today, I'd like for everybody to say the Empower Oath with me. So Brian, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. I, Tiffany Joy Green, do solemnly swear to accept the lifelong obligation to hone my superhero powers and apply those superhero powers to the good of the people I serve. I will promote and add to the ongoing success of Empower People, its members, and the people, organizations, and communities it serves. I'll help prepare the next generation of superheroes. I am driven to be a positive change agent for those I serve and interact with. And now if everyone could just take the superhero pose. Okay, Brian, and now you can go.
All right, we're going to be talking about employee handbooks today. I will make it as interesting as I possibly can. So don't get your expectations up too high because we are talking about employee handbooks, but they are important and there really is some good stuff about them that organizations should be familiar with. So coming out today, we should be familiar with the things that you got to have in your employee handbook. A lot of this is kind of boring compliance types of things, but it is important, things you really have to include in one. Next thing we're talking about is things you might want to include depending on your specific organization and how it operates. We'll spend some time talking about aligning the handbook with your company culture and purpose. This is the squishy side of things, but it's also really, really important. I think this is frankly where a lot of organizations miss a big opportunity with their handbooks, and a lot more emphasis should be put on a handbook for this purpose. And then we'll also talk about things to avoid in handbooks. Sometimes what you have in your handbook is more important than what you include. There are things you should avoid doing. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the minefields you could step into. So that's what we're going to try to cover today. Who am I? Brian Kinzie. I'm an HR consultant. I've been doing this for consulting for 7-ish years now. 25 years in HR, with anything from small local mom and pop companies to multinational organizations. Did my undergraduate degree at William & Mary. I got a post-bac in HR management. I need to, that should be BACC and not BACK. Okay. So I didn't learn how to do spell check at William & Mary apparently, but I got a post-bac in HR management and the MBA from University of Richmond. I have a SHRM-SCP professional designation. Then I started Thinker HR up by consulting organization back in 2016, serving small businesses and nonprofits. All right, so that's who I am. So let's dive into it. The basic gotta have it components that need to be in any employee handbook that you're putting together. I will put in my usual disclaimer. I am not a lawyer, and you could probably ask like 7 different HR professionals and 7 different employment attorneys what they think should be in a guy have component. You get completely different answers, but these are the things that I consider be the absolute fundamental things you've got to have in there. First of all, your equal employment opportunity policy. That's your, we do not discriminate against on the basis of paragraph you see in almost any handbook. One important thing to remember when you're putting that sense together is make sure you include your state requirements for whatever state it is that you're operating in, or if you're multi-state, you probably just want to make sure you grab all the components for all the states you're operating in. For instance, in Virginia, a few years ago, they put in language requiring veteran status and gender identity to be included. So make sure that you're including all of those things in your EEO statement. Harassment and discrimination policies. Your basic phrasing saying that you don't allow it, it's prohibited, and then very specific information on how to address a complaint if there is an issue going on. People need to know where to go to if they're having that kind of a problem in the workplace. You need to have a drug and alcohol policy. Even if you are very, very relaxed on your views on drugs and alcohol, you still need to have sort of your red line or line in the sand defined for what's permissible within your organization. Or if you're a company that has a zero tolerance policy, you need to spell that out as well. And again, for Commonwealth of Virginia, we have laws that have been put in place now surrounding use of medical cannabis. So you need to make sure that your drug alcohol policy had carve-outs in place for that. So that's important to have in there. Family Medical Leave Act, this is for bigger organizations. If you have 50 plus employees, then you fall under Family Medical Leave Act, which guarantees up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave from your job if you or an immediate family member has typically a medical type of situation. So if you're a larger employer, you need to make sure you have that. In some companies, when they tip over that 50 employee threshold, they don't update their handbooks to include that. So that's something you need to make sure you have put in there. Code of conduct. This is your basic list of things that people can get in trouble. Your laundry list of things that employees can do that can get themselves fired. So you want to have in there, like, you can't steal from the company. You can't, scrawl graffiti on the walls of the bathroom. You can't deface company property like that. You can't hit your coworkers. You can't tell your boss he's a jerk. Whatever it is that's your code of conduct. There's a fairly standard list of stuff out there that most handbooks have. Make sure you have that in there, because that way, if somebody breaks one of those cardinal rules, you have something to point to say, hey, we have in writing that you're not supposed to do this, and you did anyway. So it gives you something to point to if you're getting to a stage where you're having to take disciplinary action or having to do a separation type of situation. Report of injury, that's really important. You need to have in your handbook how to report injuries on the job, when, to who, that kind of stuff. And not quite last, but really important, your disclaimer, which is, yeah, this is all in the handbook, but we can decide at any point we want to change how we do things and do it the way we want to anyway. So that's your get out of jail free sentence, where you should never have a handbook that's going to completely bind you to doing something the same way under every circumstance, because there's always some gray area when things happen. So have a disclaimer in there that you can make changes as needs arise, because the business needs can change, and you'll never have a handbook that can cover every possible situation that could occur. So the disclaimer is important. Finally, the acknowledgement, that's where the employee signs saying, yes, I've received a copy of this and I am going to follow the rules. So acknowledgement's important too. So these are what I consider to be the gotta have it components that every handbook needs to include. Next up, what I would consider to be probably should have components. Now, a lot of people would say, hey, these are all things that you absolutely should have. And I'm not going to argue that you shouldn't absolutely have a lot of these things, but they're ones that you can still have a functional handbook and not include. But these are really good things that I think you should have in there. We'll start with mission, vision, values, and we'll talk a little bit more about alignment with company purpose later on, but this is where the company can really lay out what they're all about, how they want to operate, how they want to work in the communities that they serve, how they want to take care of their clients and customers, and what drives the organization. A lot of times you're going to see really generic mission, vision, values statements, which I understand, because let's face it, most companies are going to have some similarities and crossover, especially on the value side of things. But this is important to lay out what it is your organization's trying to do. What is our, in French, what I can't say French, I don't know how I'm going to try this, raison d'etre, is that how you say it?
Your je ne sais quoi?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, you had to learn French in your Canadian schools, didn't you?
Bilingual, baby.
so in any case, the reason your organization exists, it should be out there. And one thing I will say is that when you put out a values statement and a vision and a mission, your employees are going to see if you are living up to what you state your values and your mission and vision are. And if there's incongruence between what you say you're going to be doing versus what you are actually doing, that causes problem. There is cognitive dissonance that results when that happens. You want to avoid that. So, don't put up a values thing because you think it sounds good if you're not going to actually try to live by those values. So I'll stop preaching on that right now. A welcome and an introduction. This is a chance for whoever it is, the owner, the executive director, but for them to be able to introduce themselves and have it be personalized. You'll see, again, this is something you can have a generic one in place. Welcome to the company. We're so glad you're here, blah, blah, blah. But you can also have something that's a little bit more personal from an owner. So it's a chance for there to be a little bit of connectivity there. So I think that having one that's maybe a little bit more focused is a good thing to have in there. A table of contents sounds really silly, but you don't know how many handbooks I've seen where there's no table of contents. So you got these handbooks have got a little bit out of control. They're 70 pages long. You're trying to figure out a certain policy and you have no idea where to go to find it. So include a table of contents just for ease of use of people. Your basic workplace policies and procedures. And these are the types of things that people go to handbooks to look for. Attendance policy, hours of work, remote work policies. If you're going to be having a remote work environment, you need to kind of lay out what your expectations are there. If it's a factory environment, might want to lay out when the breaks are going to be, that kind of thing. So those are kind of things that might be very specific to your business, but kind of what your expectations are around those things. This is a good thing to put in there. Privacy expectations, or lack of privacy expectations, is probably a better way of putting it, where anything used on company device is considered company property. So people don't have an expectation that you won't be looking in their emails. You might have to look in their emails. They should know that could happen. And the open door policy, almost put this in the must-have components, but I didn't. Open door policy is really critical from the standpoint that if an employee ever gets to the point where they decide to sue the company, like something's gone horribly sideways and they're taking a lawsuit, one of the things that's going to get asked during that process is, did you follow your company's internal grievance procedure? And if a person has not followed it, a lot of times the courts will throw it out, because they're gonna be like, why did you drag the courts into it when you could have simply had a conversation internally that had it taken care of? So if you have an open door policy that lays out like, hey, you can bring anything on up the ladder to the owner if you need to, that helps tremendously in defense of those types of lawsuits. The one reason I would say to not have an open door policy is if you as an owner simply do not want to deal with these types of things coming through your door. Don't say that you're going to have an open door policy and then slam the door in people's faces when they come to you with it. So that not a good look if you're doing that. So, but open door policies are a really good idea to have. Now, what happens if there's bad weather going on? Inclement weather should be part of it. If you're in a place where parking is funky, or you have certain spots reserved for customers or things like that, include those types of things in your handbook. This is kind of where you can lay out basic expectations for how your workplace operates. Next up, certain things surrounding conduct. A conflict of interest section for what you consider to be a conflict of interest with your company. Some organizations don't care if you're working with somebody who could potentially be a competitor. Like, for instance, within the restaurant industry, if you're working at one restaurant on one night and another restaurant on Wednesday and another restaurant on Thursday, most restaurants really don't care. As long as you're there doing what you're supposed to on the night you're there, they don't care if you're working across town. Now, I can say if you're working for Coca-Cola and you're also trying to moonlight with Pepsi, Coca-Cola's going to have a problem with that. So but lay out what your expectation is for what's considered a conflict of interest. Confidentiality of internal documents, communication, that's all good stuff to have in there. Non-competes are a really tricky zone right now because of new non-compete laws within the Commonwealth of Virginia. But if you have expectations surrounding non-competes, then that is something that could be included in a handbook. Just make sure you're staying legal with it. Gift policies are a good thing to include if you have a situation, particularly for if you're purchasing people, like receiving gifts from vendors, what's considered to be okay and what's not considered to be okay. Like, if you get a box of cookies dropped off, is that all right to share amongst your friends in the office? That's probably all right. Maybe if they're dropping off a $700 golf bag, maybe that's a little excessive. you know? But again, that's going to be something that's going to vary depending on your company and your culture and what you expect. I've worked with organizations that were pretty liberal with what they allowed, and I've seen organizations that have pretty much a zero tolerance thing where, like, I don't care that they dropped the cookies off the front desk. You have to throw them out in the trash can right here, right now. So gift policy is going to have in there social media policy, like what you expect in terms of out of work behavior, or if you're going to be representing the company itself on social media. Those are good things to include. Nepotism, if you want to have policies in place surrounding not having direct relatives working for a direct relative, that kind of thing is a good thing to put in there. One thing I would caution on nepotism, if you're a family organization and like everybody in the family is working for the organization, it's a really weird look to say, yeah, but we don't allow anybody to have any other family members working here. People are like, but you're working here and your aunt's working here and all that. So not having it not be a direct reporting relationship is probably a really good move, but nepotism is something that's going to be individual to your company. Fraternization policies, I would always say to have something in there where you're not allowing supervisors and employees to date each other. I've seen some companies to try to forbid any type of dating amongst any types of employees. Same level, different departments, they try to ban it across the board. Frankly, that just doesn't work, in my opinion. So, but laying out something that does not allow the supervisor to employee relationship is a good thing to include. Your expectations surrounding weapons, smoking, your dress code, also really good things to include. And again, that's going to vary from company to company. You know, I've got some companies I work with have strict no weapons allowed policies. I have other companies I work with that, you know, pretty much everybody has a concealed carry permit and they're all packing, and that's fine. It's whatever works best for your company and culture. Should be some synergy there. Same goes for smoking and, you know, dress codes that they should reflect your company culture. Benefits section, real quickly, you should include things that lay out what your benefits are that you offer, eligibility for those benefits. I would tend to not include a whole lot of detail in an employee handbook when talking about benefits, simply because they change on a very frequent basis during open enrollment seasons. So you don't want to be saying, you know, you don't want to have handbook copies saying around our insurance is through Anthem when it's changed to US Health one year and then changed over to Optima the next year, and that just causes confusion for people. So usually I lay out the very basic details on it and then have something there for who the employee can go to find out more information. But having the section on benefits is important. Time off, this is a really important thing to include in your handbooks, unless you're not offering it, in which case you don't want to have a big section on time off that says we don't offer time off. So, but holidays, paid time off that you do offer, you know, eligibility for it, how much you get, vacation, sick time, attendance policies, how you're going to handle bereavement, your jury duty. Mention a military leave is something some companies have, some don't. How you handle a leave of absence that's not a paid time off situation. All those types of things are something you might want to consider having in your handbook. How you want to handle discipline, your progressive disciplinary policy of, you know, verbal warning, written warning, final written warning, termination, however you want to set that up. That's something that's very commonly found in handbooks. A lot of companies will have sections in there for how an employee exits from the organization as well. And I'll talk more about that later, but I wouldn't have a whole lot of stuff in your handbook on exit unless you have some really specific situation that needs to be covered. So those are what I consider to be your probably should have components. Now let's talk about the alignment of the handbook and the company culture. I think this is really, really important. Your handbook and your culture should reflect each other. And one of the key ways of doing that is through the language that you're using, how formal or how informal the speech is, the way it's written, how you refer to the employees, that all that language and tone is going to set your expectations for how you want people to interact internally within the organization and how they're going to act externally with clients. I have one client that I work with that literally has a section in there called our no asshole policy. And that's literally what it says. Now, that works within that specific company and their culture. It's perfect. And I don't think they should change it, frankly, because it works for them. Would I go and tell a church group that I'm working with that they need to have that section in their handbook? No, I wouldn't do that. So you want to make sure that your language and tone match the sort of culture that's within your organization. So that's, to me, that's really important. And also the formality of it. More informal is usually easier to read for people. So sort of toning it down a little bit, making it less like a lawyer wrote it, can sometimes be useful. The next thing, and this gets beyond the handbook, but you always have your policies and benefits laid out in your handbook, and they should be reflecting the values you want to have in your organization, what you want to put forward as how your organization operates, the things they believe in. Do you have strict attendance policy or a liberal leave policy? You know, if you're a culture where, you know, showing up for work every day and putting in a hard day's work, and, you know, it's a production environment, and if a person's missing from the line, it causes all sorts of problems, and, you know, that strict attendance policy is what is needed in that environment, then have that strict attendance policy. Or do you want to have a liberal leave policy where you can, you know, hey, you know, as long as the work gets done, we don't care if you're here every day or not. At the end of the week, did you get everything you need to get done? You can have a liberal leave policy. You can have a strict attendance policy. There's no right or wrong answer here. It's just what works for your organization. But if you're going to, for instance, say, hey, we are a family-friendly, family-first policy. You know, we're all about supporting our employees and their families. And then you have an employee saying, yeah, I need time off to take my sick kid to the doctor. And you're like, no, we're going to write you up for that. That's not having your culture and your values lining up with your actions. So whatever you put in place for these types of things, the values that you express as an organization need to match up with those policies. Working from home or working on site, that's an important thing to have. There's a certain amount of trust implied or lack of trust implied if you allow people to work remotely versus on site. If you could have a highly collaborative environment and still be a remote workplace. So it just depends on your organization. Or if you're talking about community being one of the really important things, do you allow time off for volunteering for organizations? A lot of companies will actually allow, like, you know, a certain number of hours per year where a person can go and volunteer with a local organization they are interested in and care about. Habitat for Humanity is an example, that kind of thing. So, so if that's something that you have as part of your culture, you might want to include something like that in your handbook. Tolerance for drugs or alcohol or not. That's, again, going to be something specific to your organization and how you want to set your company up. Basic guidelines for customer interaction. That kind of really depends on your organization, if people are mostly forward facing the customers or not, but that's something to consider including as well. So what your expectations are, how you have your policies and benefits set up for your organization should reflect your culture of your organization. I think that a lot of organizations miss their chance to have the values line up with their purpose and their policies. So, all right, things to avoid. These are the things that you really just don't want to do. So, first up, a handbook that no one but a lawyer can read. And I've seen these. You end up, you have a company that's got like 8 people, and they have a 75-page employee handbook. It's like written in 10-point font, and it's literally reads like a legal contract through the entire thing. And I live in handbooks a lot. I look at handbooks all the time. If I can't easily read it, then how can I remotely expect my employee to be able to wade their way through it? So it needs to be written so the normal person can read it. So that's to me is really critical. Have it be readable. You want your employees to be able to use it. You want your managers to be able to use it. You want to be able to use it yourself. So handbooks that no one but lawyer can read. Avoid that. Including policies that you will never enforce. Don't put rules in that you're not going to enforce. That's just to me the most basic thing in the world. Why would you put something in if you have no inclination to enforce it at all? If you're not going to enforce it, you don't have a rule about it. You just leave it out. An example from my past, my company was putting in a dress code policy. Terrific. Okay, we decided we need to tighten some things up a little bit. We were going to put in a formal dress code. Okay. One of the things they wanted to include in it was a no hats in the office policy. If you're in the office, you can't wear a hat. Well, we had an employee who'd worked there for 20 plus years. I had never seen that person not wear a hat the entire time they had worked there. Literally never once seen them without a hat on. So my question at the time was like, okay, great. You want to put in a no hat policy? Fine. Who's going to tell this employee they can't wear a hat anymore? No one wanted to have the conversation with that employee. So we took out that line of the policy. It's like, point being, you weren't going to enforce it with this one employee, so don't put it in there. It shouldn't be in there. So don't put in rules you don't need to have in there if you're not going to enforce them. Including policies that aren't legal. You'd be surprised how many people have stuff in their handbooks that they say they're going to do certain things, and those things are not allowed under the law. For instance, a lot of older handbooks will have language in them saying, don't discuss your pay with your coworkers. Well, that's expressly allowed under National Labor Relations Act. So you can't have something like that in there. You can't try to enforce it. Never put something in your handbook that's going to run afoul of the law. So that's just one example. There's a lot of other things that I've seen in handbooks where, things for like, clawing back money for, lost property, all sorts of things where companies can get themselves in trouble if they try to do it the way they have in their handbook. So just be careful what you have in your policies is illegal, legal and up to code and all that good stuff. One thing to avoid is stating you're going to do things that you might not actually do. And I see this with handbooks that the layout, we perform reviews at 6 months. We will do a review 30 days after a person starts. We do annual reviews. That's great if you're actually going to do those things. But then if you're not, you've set up an expectation that you're not meeting. So it's not something that's required to be an employee handbook that you lay out that we're doing performance appraisals at all. That's not required for a handbook. So if there's a chance you might not be doing a performance appraisal 1 year for whatever reason, don't say that you're going to. Don't put in a bonus program that you don't actually have in place anymore. Don't promise exit interviews to employees if you don't always do exit interviews. So the handbook needs to line up with reality. So that's one thing that I think is really critical, is your handbook needs to reflect how you actually operate as an organization. Language that doesn't match your organization. Again, we talked already about the formal, informal. And this one thing, lengthy sections on departing the company. I was reviewing a handbook a few months back. It was a 22-page handbook. They had 3 entire pages about how to leave the organization. That's not a good look for a handbook when a big section of your handbook is set around leaving the company. That's not what we're trying to do with our handbook. We're trying to retain people and track people and that kind of stuff. So we want to avoid those types of things. In summary, remember why and when a person's actually going to be looking at this document. Because no one's going to sit down and, I shouldn't say no one, very few people are going to sit down and read your entire handbook word for word. Even fewer are going to commit it to memory after that. So you want to think about when people are going to have their touch points with the handbook. Number one, when they're a brand new employee and they're learning about you. This is when I think it's really important to have the expectations and the culture and those things emphasized. It is a chance for you to do some internal marketing to your employees. And a lot of companies say, hey, our employees, they're the most important thing. And then they'll have a handbook where the handbook literally was someone else, some other company's handbook, and they just scratched out the name and put their company's name on there. Don't do that. It's like if the employees are that important, then your handbook needs to also reflect that you care about the employees. And if you have something in there that's obviously wasn't really meant for these employees, it's going to show. So when they're new and learning about you, this is your chance to make your first impression on an employee. So that's critical. People are going to look in the handbook when they're trying to figure out how something works. That typically surrounds time off policies. Honestly, that's when most people go look at their handbook, like, how many days off of vacation do I get? When am I eligible for this? And that kind of thing. So they're going to look when they're trying to figure out how things work. They're going to look at when they have a problem. So if there is a specific issue they have, okay, my coworker is doing something I don't like. What do I do? I'm going to go look in the handbook and see what it tells me I'm supposed to do for this situation. And you'd be surprised how many people actually go do that when they're having a problem, to see what it is they're supposed to be doing to handle things. So that's when they go into it, and they need to be able to find an answer, because at that point they're upset about something. So they need to have a clear direction of, it might just say, hey, go talk to your supervisor, but that's fine. It's told them what they need to do. They know what their next step is. They can find out how they need to resolve their situation. And then remember, if you have supervisors and managers, it's not just you, the boss. People look out when they're trying to check on policy to see, like, okay, well, my employees come and ask me for leave of some sort. How am I supposed to handle this? And the supervisor will go look in the handbook so they can come back to their employee with an actual answer, as opposed to just making up something. And it's also important, again, for owners themselves, if you don't have layers of management, a lot of times, you might not have formalized policies in place. The handbook is kind of a good way to memorialize how you're actually trying to operate as an organization. So that was a lot of handbook talk. So does anybody have any questions at this point?
Well, first and foremost, I want to thank everybody who was listening in on Facebook. We're going to close that now because the next portion is Ask the Advisor, and that's a question part, which is only open to members only. So if you're not a member, you want to go to Empower People, MPWRpeople.org/join, and you can join Empower People there. This recording is going to be posted on the members only site. So thank you, Facebook watchers. I'll look forward to seeing you another time.